Have you ever heard a melody that was never truly played, yet somehow echoed deep within you, as if awakening something long buried? In the rain-drenched woods of Thistlebridge, a silent instrument stirs once more, and each note it never played whispers of a hidden body, a buried truth and a lie carefully composed. This isn't just a story, it's the haunting sound of music that was never meant to be heard, until the weight of the truth was finally ready to be carried. It was one of those rare nights that didn't feel like a part of the calendar but something ancient and waiting, something that arrived not with time but with intent. The sky was an obsidian shroud, smothering the moon entirely, and the wind moved through the narrow gullies and blackened chimneys like a soul denied rest, wailing with such fury it felt personal. Rain didn't fall, it struck, each drop like a warning, as if the heavens themselves were trying to wash away something that clung too tightly to the earth. In Wren Hollow, a village already living on the knife edge of folklore and memory, doors were not simply locked, they were bolted, barred, sealed with symbols half remembered from nursery rhymes no one dared question. Children were hushed, fires dimmed, and all eyes avoided the looming silhouette at the edge of the moors, Thornwatch Manor. The house itself looked less like a residence and more like a secret someone tried to forget. Its once grand towers now sagged under the weight of time, and its windows reflected not candlelight but something darker, deeper. Inside, Jonathan Elric, once a composer of global acclaim, now a recluse remembered more for tragedy than talent, sat alone at his harpsichord, an instrument untouched for years, draped in cloth and dust, but now inexplicably bared to the open air like an exposed nerve. He didn't play so much as summon something with his fingers, coaxing out a melody that didn't sound written but remembered, low, wavering, and heartbreakingly unfinished. Shadows moved oddly in the room, pulsing with each note, and the fire in the hearth crackled with a strange, sulphurous smell. It was said in whispers that Jonathan had once written a piece so beautiful it made people weep, and then swore never to perform again after his twin sister Isadora died the night of its debut in a fire that consumed the family wing of the manor. That very melody, the one declared cursed and sealed away, was now leaking back into existence, not from memory, but from the very walls, as if the house had learned to hum. At dawn, the village awoke to a world still drenched and hollow. The housekeeper, Ruth, returned early, her coat soaked and breath clouding from more than just the cold. The moment she crossed the manor's threshold, she said the silence felt wrong, as though sound itself had abandoned the place. She found him in the music room, Jonathan slumped at the keys, eyes open but unfocused, mouth slightly parted as if mid-breath, yet cold as stone. In his rigid hand he clutched a burnt scrap of sheet music, one that matched none of his known compositions. The room bore no signs of struggle, no breakage, no injury, only the unmistakable scent of charred lilac, Isadora's signature perfume, locked away with her ashes decades ago. The doctor, pale and visibly shaken, gave a cold diagnosis, stroke perhaps brought on by stress or age, but he didn't meet Ruth's eyes, nor could he explain why every single clock in Thornwatch had stopped at precisely 2:13 a.m., the exact moment the fire began all those years ago. Nor could he explain the faint scorch marks along the edge of the harpsichord lid, where words etched in a childish trembling hand read, "Play me and remember." In the following days, rumors consumed Wren Hollow like mold, that Jonathan had begun hearing the melody in his sleep, that he told the mirror once he saw his sister's reflection blink, that he'd whispered to the postmaster about a voice in the East Wing. Eleanor Blythe, the village historian, was the only one brave or curious enough to return to Thornwatch after the funeral. She didn't touch anything, but she swore, hand on her rosary, that as she stood in the music room, the air changed, and that the harpsichord, though untouched, played a single note all on its own. A note held too long and far too sad to be anything but a memory given breath. "They say the house never forgets," Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling of the ancient walls, her eyes glazed as though they were looking at something only she could see, something that had long slipped into the shadows. Her fingers hovered above the porcelain tea set like trembling moths, hesitant, remembering. Miss Elspeth Marple, dignified as always in her grey wool and soft-spoken wisdom, sat quietly in the armchair opposite, her sharp eyes taking in more than she ever let on, like how the tray carried 2 cups of tea, both perfectly poured, steamless now but untouched, their delicate rims free of any smudges. And what was it that the house remembered exactly? She asked, the question carrying the weight of unspoken things. Clara looked down at her lap, where her hands clutched the torn sheet music, yellowing at the edges, titled in Lionel Greaves' distinctive handwriting, "Elegy in D minor, for that which cannot speak." "He called it his last confession," she said, her voice barely audible. The name struck something in Miss Marple, a note without a chord, dissonant. The air felt thick, as though sound itself had memory, clinging to curtains and floorboards. Her gaze drifted to the piano, a grand silent beast resting with its lid still raised, keys slightly dusted but not untouched, as if someone had played it not long ago. Yet no one had lived in the house for weeks. Then there were the other details. Small, unassuming, but together they formed a quiet scream. The candle by the side table, its wax melted unnaturally despite the claim that the power had gone out during the storm. The clock above the mantel stopped precisely at 3:19 a.m., its second hand quivering like a breath held too long. The faint scent of burning varnish in a room where no fire had been lit. The doctor had called it a cardiac arrest, natural causes, given Greaves' age and solitary lifestyle. But Miss Marple had buried too many friends, heard too many neat lies wrapped in medical language to accept such tidy explanations. Death, she knew, wasn't silent, it was an amplifier. It took the smallest tremors of life and made them echo. A creak became a warning, a whisper became a confession, and grief, true grief, never sat this neatly. In a village like Ashby Hollow, where every ivy-covered gate hid a secret, and memory was often sharper than truth, Lionel Greaves' death should have closed a chapter. Instead, it opened something darker. The funeral was proper enough, modest hymns, trembling hands, whispers tucked behind gloved fingers, yet it was the aftermath that stirred the soil. At the bakery it was mentioned that Greaves hadn't bought his weekly rye loaf in nearly a month. At the grocer's they spoke of a gramophone record returned to the library under his name, one nobody remembered him borrowing. Outside the post office, Mrs. Pennington claimed to have heard a sickening, unnatural melody from the Red Gables the night before his death, a sound that gnawed at your bones. These weren't just stories. Miss Marple understood the rhythm of such whispers. They were clues in disguise. At the weekly social at St. Bartleby's Hall, where the smell of cucumber sandwiches mingled with mothballs and perfumed regret, the conversation took its usual path, from jam quality to hat styles, until it settled on Clara's mourning veil, a touch too dramatic, said Mrs. Featherstone, who had worn lilac at her third husband's funeral. But then came the mention of a stranger. A tall, pale man with an accent no one could quite place, seen standing outside the music shop days before Greaves died, his eyes fixed on the upstairs window as if listening for something invisible, something unfinished. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind had already begun to weave the pattern, a dying composer, an unfinished confession, a melody that refused to be silenced, and a house that remembered things best left buried. She sipped her lukewarm tea, eyes returning to the piano. There was something haunting in the way the lid remained open, as though the final note had yet to be played, and in that silence, something waited, not with menace but with memory, a memory strong enough to kill. Miss Marple didn't believe in ghosts, but she did believe in grief, in guilt, and in the dreadful music they sometimes composed together. They say this village sleeps quietly, murmured Mrs. Blake, her voice low and brittle like a page turned too often, the spoon in her teacup circling slowly, more out of memory than purpose. But there are footsteps that don't settle in dust. They echo in the air long after they've gone. Her eyes narrowed as though watching the past step quietly into the room. He wasn't from around here, that much I know. Tall, skin like parchment, face unreadable, as if carved in grief. His coat was sharp, immaculate, yet his shoes not a speck of mud on them, even though it had rained 2 nights before. Tuesday it was. Yes, Tuesday. He came straight to the Red Gables, walked up to the gate and just stood there. Didn't knock, didn't move. Just stared, like he was waiting for something, maybe permission, or a signal to destroy the place. Mrs. Featherstone, who had been quietly listening with fingers curled tight around her knitting, gave a slow nod. I saw him too. Afternoon light was dim that day, but there was something off. He didn't cast a proper shadow. That single sentence pulled Miss Marple into sharper focus. It wasn't the umbrella, or the polished shoes, or even the silence of the stranger that struck her. It was the timing. Tuesday, just 2 days before Harold Merton's death. And the night that followed, the music had returned to Red Gables, a place that hadn't heard a single note in over 15 years. The piano, untouched since the war, played again with a force that didn't feel human. No carriage had been seen, no vehicle reported, no name remembered, a figure who appeared unannounced and left no trace. It was precisely such ghost-like intrusions that most dismissed as imagination, but Miss Marple had long since learned to listen to those whispers others ignored. It is often the phantoms of truth that haunt most deeply. She said nothing aloud, only recorded one more entry in the ever-thickening ledger of her mind, a man with a grey umbrella, a tune that should have stayed buried, and a house still groaning under the weight of unspoken grief. Later that week, Miss Marple visited Clara Merton in a house thick with the silence of mourning. The curtains remained drawn, the air still, the furniture looking less like objects and more like witnesses. Clara, composed but pale, carried the weariness of sleepless nights and thoughts chasing themselves in circles. They sat together, cups of tea cooling between them, untouched, and when Miss Marple gently brought up the music, Clara hesitated, Her eyes dropped to the carpet, as if it might confess something she could not. "He wrote it years ago," she said, voice barely above a breath. "He called it Elegy in D minor. Said it came to him in a field hospital during the war, after his friend died. He never played it, not once. Said it unsettled him. Said it only brought sorrow." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, encouraging without pressing, but it returned. Clara nodded, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Yes, just before it happened. He told me it was back, said he could hear it again, even in his dreams, claimed it was unfinished, that he wanted to destroy it, but couldn't find the original manuscript. He thought it had a will of its own." Miss Marple asked gently, "And you never found it?" Clara's eyes brimmed with something unspoken, fear, maybe, or a dread she couldn't name. "No, that's the strangest part. After he died, I turned the house upside down. Every drawer, every box, every shelf, it's gone. Not a page, not a line. It's like it vanished along with him." Miss Marple sat back slightly, a quiet knowing settling into her posture. Composers do not simply lose work they consider dangerous, not unless they're hiding it from themselves or someone else has already found it. If Harold Merton had truly heard that melody again, it meant something, or someone had awakened it. Whether by accident or design, that act had unlocked something tightly sealed. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the late afternoon sun touched the twisted limbs of an old withered rosebush outside the gate. Some things, she reflected, do not die simply because they're buried. They wait, and sometimes all they need is the right listener to rise again. When Miss Marple returned to Red Gables a second time, she came not with condolences, but with gentle persistence disguised in sympathy, a skill honed from years of watching truth play hide-and-seek behind polite silence. Clara looked exhausted but oddly eager to speak, like someone haunted by quiet things that refused to be silenced. And as they spoke in that dim drawing-room, its air full of old books, faded velvet and things left unsaid, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel it again, that subtle humming presence, like a single unresolved chord vibrating beneath the surface of everything. The stranger, the missing composition, and the house that had been silent too long. Something had returned to Red Gables, and it wasn't finished. They called it nothing more than a composition, just a sequence of notes on a yellowed manuscript, but those who had heard it never spoke of it lightly. The requiem in ash grey wasn't simply played, it was summoned, as if each chord reached into a hidden wound and pulled grief from the shadows. Evelyn Rosenthal first spoke of it one storm-choked afternoon as thunder coiled in the distant hills and the windows trembled in their frames. She sat across from Inspector Denham, her fingers wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup as though it might anchor her to the present. "He composed it after the fire," she said, eyes flickering to the hearth, now cold but once the source of unspoken horrors, the fire that consumed his brother, his childhood home, and nearly him. He said the piece came to him in fragments during dreams, whispers in smoke, and once it was finished, it left him. Her voice cracked, like it had taken something in return. Denham said nothing, knowing that silence often unearthed more than interrogation. She continued, a ghost of breath on her lips. "He only performed it once, alone, behind closed doors. When I asked him how it sounded, he just looked at me and said, 'I don't remember playing it, but I remember what it took from me.'" She told the inspector the sheet music had been hidden, sealed in the piano's concealed chamber, never to be touched again. But 3 nights ago, someone or something had played it. Just a few bars. Not enough to form the full melody, but enough to make her blood turn to ice. "It was wrong," she whispered. Slower, like someone was trying to recall it, or trying desperately not to. Denham's eyes settled on the old upright piano in the corner. It sat untouched by dust, as though someone had recently closed the lid. When he opened it, the keys were pristine, and a faint scent of scorched wood rose from them, almost imperceptible, like the breath of the past. That night, driven by an unease that clawed deeper with every thought, Denham began researching the requiem. He found only 2 confirmed performances beyond the composer's own. The first in 1922, in a candlelit room where a young violinist collapsed mid-play, later refusing to speak or sleep, reportedly mumbling in a dead language. The second, in 1937, played in secret at a gathering of music historians, one of whom was found dead in his library. The next morning, face contorted, not from pain but from sheer terror, with no apparent cause. And always, at the edge of every account, lingered the same detail. The air in the room grew unnaturally cold, and somewhere nearby something creaked, wood perhaps, or bone. The composer Alistair Greaves had disappeared less than a year after finishing the piece. Not fled, not relocated, disappeared, leaving behind only a photograph, a blurred image of him standing among the blackened ruins of his home, cradling a violin whose strings had melted and fused together. No one could explain how the photo had been taken, or by whom. Denham returned to Evelyn at dawn, shadows still long in the hallway, and asked, "Do you know who else heard it?" Her reply was slow, deliberate, like an echo dragged from memory. "It doesn't matter who hears it," she said. "It matters who invites it." But before he could ask what she meant, the first delicate, mournful notes began to float through the house again, not from the piano, but from beneath the floorboards, as if the melody had sunk into the foundations and waited years to rise again. Somewhere deep within the timbre of the music, there was grief, but not ordinary grief. This grief was ritual, shaped by ashes and silence, and now it was awakening. The arrival of Lawrence Everhart in Dunsmuir Hollow was not so much an event as it was an intrusion, silent, deliberate, and timed with uncanny precision. He stepped out of the carriage just as the chapel bell across the moor struck its final hollow chime, though no funeral had been scheduled for that hour. The wind paused for a beat, as if watching. At Elmshade Manor, where the air had long since settled into the dust of forgotten sonatas and shuttered grief, a ripple passed like a cold breath through its withering corridors. Lawrence was not unwelcome, but something in his arrival unsettled the bones of the place. He wore the city on him like a cloak, tailored, polished, gleaming with the perfume of performance, and yet beneath that was something older, heavier, as though he had travelled not just across miles, but across eras. A celebrated librettist by trade, revered in distant opera houses for work that bore the names of dead prodigies, Lawrence was also a man wrapped in rumour. In hushed corners of candlelit salons, people whispered that he had ghostwritten entire compositions for composers who had vanished, and that he had once bartered a score in exchange for a silence that spanned generations. His presence at the manor, under the pretence of mourning the late Thaddeus Greer, seemed oddly punctual, too punctual, as if his journey had not been prompted by grief, but by a summons he alone had heard. He carried a leather satchel, weather-worn and stitched at the edges, not with the casual ease of a traveller, but with the protective caution of someone guarding a living thing. Its weight appeared to pull more than his shoulder. It seemed to anchor him against the very air. Miss Edwina Harrow noticed this first. She stood at the top of the curving staircase, her fingers resting on the railing like a poised question mark. She had known Thaddeus since they were children in the chapel choir, when his voice had trembled through stained glass and hers held the note steady. She had seen grief in many forms, delirious, weeping, violent, but this calculated reverence Lawrence exuded was too smooth, too practiced, like a line read one too many times on a stage no longer lit. "I only wish to ensure his final cantata is treated with the reverence it deserves," he had said, his voice precise, modulated, almost mechanical. Edwina had not mentioned the cantata. No one had, not aloud. It was a secret Thaddeus had nurtured in private during his final months, composing in seclusion, sometimes humming fragments to the garden birds, never allowing a soul to read a single note. Only his housekeeper perhaps knew of its existence, and yet 2 days after his death, the drawer in his writing desk, locked and hidden beneath a false panel, was found conspicuously empty. There were no signs of forced entry. The key remained in its hidden cubby, but the cantata was gone. What remained was stranger still. A single curled feather, deep black, not from any local bird, rested inside the drawer, its edges brittle with age. The scent of old parchment and something sharper, burnt oil perhaps, lingered, but it was the message scratched into the wood beneath the velvet lining that chilled Edwina. In silence it survives, not written, etched, as if by someone too afraid to speak. She recognized the hand. It was Thaddeus's, and it had not been carved in haste. From that moment on the manor shifted. Doors that had never creaked began groaning under unseen pressure. Mirrors fogged at strange hours. The music room, once the soul of the house, grew inexplicably cold, even when the hearth was ablaze. The atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, as though sound were trying to break through the walls. Then came Eleanor Bryce. The young maid with trembling hands found one evening crumpled beside the cellar door, her face streaked with tears, her apron twisted between white-knuckled fists. She insisted she'd heard the cantata playing, not from the music room, not from any known corner of the house, but from beneath it, from deep below the foundations, as if the stone itself had learned to sing. It wasn't music, she whispered to Miss Harrow, her eyes wide and glistening with a terror too old for her years. It was like something waking up. She could not describe the melody, only that it made her feel remembered, as though the notes were calling her by name. That very night, while windless stillness gripped the manor like a held breath, a painting in the music room, a portrait of Thaddeus's great-grandfather, plummeted from its hooks. It shattered on the marble floor. Behind it, etched into the plaster in a trembling line, was a sentence no one admitted placing there. "He who listens remembers what should remain forgotten." The words pulsed faintly in the dim lamplight, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The following morning brought further disquiet. Rupert Vale, a distant cousin and one-time heir to a portion of Thaddeus's estate, fell from the main staircase. He claimed no memory of what led him there. "I only meant to fetch a book," he had said earlier that night. His fall was not fatal, but when he awoke groggy and ghost-pale, he began to hum a strange melancholic refrain that matched almost note for note what Eleanor had described. When confronted, he swore he had never heard it before. Yet he could not stop. Even in sleep, his lips moved with the rhythm of a tune buried in silence. Miss Harrow now saw the truth forming like condensation on a forgotten mirror. The cantata had not vanished. It had awakened, and it was no longer confined to paper and ink. It had become something else, something that fed on memory, silence and the fraying edges of time. Whether Lawrence Everhart had come to retrieve it, or to silence it, or perhaps even to serve it remained unclear. But she no longer trusted his satchel, nor the stories he told of Thaddeus's genius. There was a hunger in his gaze, a flicker in his posture whenever the house creaked like a man listening for instructions. Now, when music echoed through Elmshade, it came without source. When memories stirred, they came in fragments of sound. And as dusk fell earlier each night, and the fog clung tighter to the windows, Miss Harrow understood one terrible certainty. The manor was no longer holding secrets. It was reciting them, measure by measure, to anyone foolish or fated enough to listen. The wind that swept across Windmere Hollow the morning after Dr. Huldus Finch's arrival carried more than just the scent of rain-soaked earth. It carried a resonance, an unsettled hush, like a forgotten chord struck in a cathedral long abandoned. Belcroft House stood in the hollow like a relic carved from nightmares, its crumbling spires choking on ivy, and its windows dark with reflection, as though the glass remembered what the walls dared not say. Dr. Finch, a once renowned forensic acoustician who had vanished from public life after a series of inexplicable breakdowns during court testimonies, said little as he stepped through the manor's groaning doors. "I was summoned," he said quietly, though no one had claimed to have sent for him, not even Seraphine Blaine, niece to the late Horatio Blaine, whose death was still spoken of in shivers and pauses. Horatio, a composer of ill-tempered genius, had perished 2 weeks prior, alone in the conservatory during a storm that local legends now said carried more than lightning. Rumors swirled of a final symphony, unwritten, unplayed, yet somehow recorded, a composition not heard by the living but felt like grief in the marrow. Seraphine had never trusted the house, not truly. It shifted in the periphery, like a stage set collapsing behind the curtain. Since Horatio's death, small phenomena had begun to accumulate like static before a broadcast. The old brass metronome atop his desk, untouched for years, had resumed ticking at odd intervals, sometimes slow and measured, other times erratic and fevered, even though its winding mechanism had long been broken. Mireille Duval, the aging pianist who once accompanied Horatio's darker sonatas, awoke one night to the sound of scales being played on the grand piano in the solarium, notes ascending and descending with surgical precision, but when she entered, the room was empty and still, save for a cracked glass of water beside the keys, as if something had thirsted after playing. Aldous, who walked the halls with a tuning fork in one hand and a leather-bound journal in the other, said little but listened constantly, not with his ears, but with his body, as though sound moved through his bones instead of air. It was he who discovered the first anomaly. Beneath the carpet of Horatio's study was a trapdoor no one remembered, and within it reels of magnetic tape, each labelled only with a date and the word interlude. The audio was faint, degraded, but laced with strange harmonics and ghost-like murmurs, as if something beneath the recordings was pressing forward. On one tape, a voice distorted, slow whispered a line that would haunt them all. He played the silence and the silence played him back. The following days brought deeper unease. Ellis Ward, the groundskeeper with a stutter and a 1,000-yard stare, found claw marks etched into the bark of the rowan trees that circled the estate. Claw marks, he insisted, that bled sap in perfect tempo, pulsing like a metronome. The next morning, Moreo discovered that the keys on the piano had rearranged themselves overnight. Middle C was no longer where it had been. Aldous confirmed this, tracing the frequency map and showing that the pitch had remained, but the physical key had moved, as though the instrument itself was trying to recompose the scale. Seraphine, increasingly sleep-deprived and pale, reported vivid dreams of a concert hall made of bones, where invisible figures in the audience hummed a melody she couldn't remember upon waking, but could not stop hearing in the walls. One night, she sleepwalked into the library and stood before Horatio's portrait, humming a descending fifth. Without warning, the painting split open, canvas torn by a sudden gust of wind that came from nowhere. Behind it, carved into the plaster, was a phrase in Latin, per auditus reviviscit, through hearing it lives again. The turning point came when Aldous deciphered the broken wax cylinder found hidden in the attic. The melody, though fractured, was unmistakably incomplete, as if the final movement of the symphony had been intentionally left undone. "This isn't composition," he murmured, "it's transcription," and that changed everything. If Horatio hadn't composed the last piece, who had? Or what? That night, the manor itself seemed to breathe, floors swelled beneath their feet, walls pulsed with muffled thuds like a distant drum, doors began to resist opening unless knocked upon in a particular rhythm. Light bulbs flickered not with electricity, but in time to an unheard score. It became clear Belcroft House had become an instrument, not merely haunted, but possessed by unfinished music, by a symphony written not in notes but in echoes. Then came the worst of it. Ellis disappeared, leaving behind only his boots and a page torn from Horatio's diary. If music is memory made sound, then this house remembers too much. Seraphine, overcome with terror, tried to flee but found herself lost in a corridor that should have led to the kitchen but instead opened into the basement, where she heard unmistakably her uncle's voice calling her name in time with a lullaby she hadn't heard since childhood. Mireille suffered a stroke after playing what she believed was only a few bars of the reconstructed melody. Before losing consciousness, she uttered her final words. It's not music anymore, it's a ritual. Now only Aldous remains, still scribbling in his journal as the wind outside rises again and the house begins to hum. He knows now that Horatio did not die of natural causes. He was consumed, his mind hollowed to become the vessel for something that existed not in sound, but in silence manipulated. And as Aldous places the final reel on the player and locks the door behind him, he whispers a single phrase to the house that now watches him through its own vibrations. Let the final movement play, and let no one survive to remember it wrong. For what had begun as a search for a composer's last work had become something far more terrifying, a symphony not meant to be heard but finished. And in finishing it the house would be complete. And it would sing. In the veiled quiet of Elmbrook Hollow, where the ivy curled like secrets around rusting gates and even the wind spoke in hesitant murmurs, there rose again a name that had long since been buried under decades of silence and soot-stained memory. Daniel Whitcomb. Once a brilliant violinist whose melodies had drawn tears from marble faces, now nothing more than a half-whispered legend among villagers who dared not speak too loudly of what they'd heard, or thought they'd seen. The story of Daniel was not one that lived on in newspapers or concert halls, but in unfinished sentences, in glances exchanged when the old Whitcomb cottage flickered with light after midnight, though no one had lived there for years, not officially. Miss Agatha Crowhurst, with her gentle manners and tea-sweet smile, had lived long enough to know that the truth often lies in the overlooked corners and the pauses between words, and it was she who first noticed the disturbances, the way birds avoided the chimney, the faint residue of candle wax beneath the parlour window, a solitary chair shifted as though someone had risen abruptly and never returned. Then came the first clue. Laid upon her churchyard bench as though placed by invisible hands, an envelope, unsealed, containing a single line in jagged script. He never stopped playing. The following week another note appeared, accompanied by a fragment of a musical score, its ink faded, its bars uneven, vibrating with a strange urgency. The handwriting, unmistakably Daniel's, stirred memories of the fire at Windermere Conservatoire, an event never fully explained. Some said it was sabotage, others believed it was the music itself that had caused the blaze. As Agatha followed the trail, she uncovered the name of Elena Thorne, a cellist of luminous talent and Daniel's closest confidante, whose untimely death in 1919 had once sent ripples through the village. Found in the mill pond, her fingers clutching the charred edge of a composition never completed, her demise had been ruled accidental, though the facts never quite aligned. The pond shallow, her lungs only half filled with water, and bruising around her wrists that no one had accounted for. Daniel vanished days later, and though some said they'd seen him boarding a train west, others believed he never left at all, but disappeared into his music, into the walls of his home, into the broken staves of a requiem no one was meant to hear. It was the vicar's niece, Clara, who stumbled upon the box, hidden behind a rotting pew in the oldest part of the chapel, marked only with a bleeding treble clef. Inside were Eleanor's letters, brittle and stained, each page recounting a slow unraveling of love, yes, but also of fear, of a melody Daniel had composed that seemed to consume him from the inside. One line echoed above all. He plays it at night now, over and over. It is no longer music, it is confession. Miss Crowhurst pieced together the fractured history with growing unease, recognizing that Daniel had not merely mourned Elena, he had tried to trap her memory, her essence, into something eternal, something sacred and dangerous. As she uncovered the final score, hidden beneath layers of wallpaper in the attic, titled Reverie for the Damned, she noticed strange glyphs woven between the notes, Latin phrases such as Audia patebi and Memoria tenetur. Listen and it shall be revealed, memory is held fast. It was not just music, it was a summoning, a lament built to bind something unspeakable. And now, as the violin's faint strain seemed to echo through the hedgerows once again, Miss Crowhurst understood this was no simple haunting, no lover's tragedy, but a masterpiece of grief designed to ensure that no one forgot, no matter the cost. Daniel had not left the village, he had embedded himself into the composition, and now the composition was waking. Fielding had always been the kind of name you'd find scribbled in the margins, never quite anonymous, never truly embraced, but now, with Lillian buried in silence, Harold sealed in memory, and Thomas reduced to a sorrowful trace of music and pain, Fielding remained, the last corner of a square once whole, now splintered and unsteady. Blood had tied him to Lillian, once friendship to Harold, and some distant unspeakable tether to Thomas, but never had he truly belonged to any of them. And when Miss Elowen Greyfold came across the old forgotten letters, creased tucked behind drawers like broken secrets, they didn't accuse or indict, but they flickered with a darkness deeper than fact. They unveiled not murder, but betrayal, not crime, but inheritance laced with bitterness, and affection turned to rust. Resentments had ripened in silence, grief had fermented into something colder, and those pages whispered of promises made, and then punished. Elowen folded them into her handbag, like one might tuck away a shard of glass, dangerous but necessary. Grief, she reflected, if left unspoken did not fade, it spoiled, and with that heavy knowing, she walked toward the churchyard, not to mourn but to listen. There, where the past curled around headstones like mist, Thomas's grave lay humbly toward the north edge, half in shadow, half in the hushed light of a late afternoon. His name was brief, his years too few, his epitaph silent, but at the stone's edge, hidden beneath the velvet crust of moss and time, was a symbol, lightly carved but not by nature. It was musical, a flat sign, a downward pull in pitch, melancholy carved into stone. No local hand had placed it there, and few would recognize it, but someone had, someone for whom music was not mere sound but language and memory, crime and confession. Perhaps Harold had done it in solitude, or Fielding with trembling hands, or another figure altogether, one still hiding in plain sight. As Elowen walked back from the graveyard, the puzzle pieces began falling faster. She remembered the solicitor's troubled whisper, the one about Clara's papers, or rather their absence. For years everyone had assumed her adopted formally, legally, but no record confirmed it, and if Clara were disqualified, then who stood next in line? Fielding, the quiet man whose ambitions had once been drowned beneath Merton's legacy, whose music had gone unheard, and whose silence now sounded dangerously close to calculation. It was no longer clear whether the past was being honoured or erased, so Miss Greyfold devised an evening, a subtle gathering masked as musical appreciation. Clara was asked to bring whatever sketches of her uncle's music she had salvaged, pages incomplete, stained with memory and perhaps her own reconstructions. Young Mr. Lysander Bell was invited to play, a gentle soul, gifted in sorrowful tones, careful enough not to ask too many questions, and when he began the first bars of elegy in D minor, the room shifted. The air felt closer, almost damp. The melody didn't shout, it confessed, it wept, it bled slowly. Clara, seated by the window, stiffened as if struck. Her hands gripped the table's edge. A beat later, her teacup rattled violently in its saucer. Fielding stared at the floor, unmoved, unreadable. Elowen didn't miss a breath, a blink, a twitch. This wasn't just a song. It was a question. It was a shadow laid bare. Someone had wanted this melody played again. But not for remembrance, for revelation. And now, as each note filled the room like a slow leak of truth, Miss Greyfold knew the secret wasn't in who had written the music, but who had tried to bury it, and why it was finally being heard again. As the final note dissolved into silence, an unsettling stillness gripped the drawing room. Not the graceful kind that trails after applause, but a breathless, strained quiet, as if the very air had grown cautious. The chandelier above trembled faintly, disturbed by a draught that no one had noticed until then. Beneath the glowering oil portrait of Admiral Redford, Lucian Thorne stood motionless, his back to the room, his profile caught in sharp relief by the candlelight. His hand, once loosely resting on the back of an embroidered chair, was now curled tightly into a fist, his knuckles bleached white, jaw locked as though holding back a scream. The others remained seated, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just occurred, because what had been played on the grand piano was no ordinary performance. It had started as a forgotten lullaby, once composed by a woman long since buried, but by the time the final chord twisted into an off-key dissonant spiral, it had become something else entirely, unfamiliar, disturbing, almost accusatory. Lucian's breath caught just once, audibly, and then without a word, without apology or excuse, he pivoted on his heel and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him like the lock on a coffin. Miss Evelyn Drewell, seated nearest the fireplace, did not rise nor flinch. Her eyes merely followed the abandoned sheet music on the stand, the pages slightly curled, their ink catching firelight like blood on parchment. She turned then to Cordelia Vance, the young pianist whose fingers were still trembling above the keys, as if her body refused to believe the song had ended. Evelyn's voice was calm, but edged with gravity. "Did the music match what your mother used to play?" Cordelia, pale as frost, hesitated before whispering, "Mostly, but some markings I don't know where they came from. I added a few, but others were already there. Variations she never taught me. Variations she would never have dared to write. Evelyn offered no comfort, only the faintest nod, because this was exactly what she had suspected. This melody was not a tribute, not a lament. It was a message, a provocation, a puzzle arranged in sound. Someone had unearthed an old grief, tampered with its rhythm, and then released it into this room like a ghost summoned by music. Later that evening, under the amber glow of her reading lamp, Evelyn pored over the musical sheets Cordelia had brought. Her eyes traced every measure, noting how the notations bore the pressure of several different hands, one confident and elegant, another more jagged, uncertain, and at least one written in evident haste. There were passages subtly bent out of shape, a tempo altered by just enough to warp its emotion, a rest held long enough to break the rhythm, harmonies that drifted into darkness where light once lived. These weren't mistakes, they were surgical edits, meant to infect the soul of the song. On the back of one fragment, Evelyn noticed a purplish watermark, barely visible but familiar. A rare brand of paper manufactured in Marseille, used briefly in the 1980s by a reclusive French composer rumored to have faked his own death. Another page carried the faint scent of violets, Lucien's cologne, unmistakable and too fresh to be coincidence. But it was the smallest detail that chilled her most. Just beneath the treble clef of a particularly haunting measure, an almost invisible symbol had been etched into the ink, an alchemical glyph used by a secret society of composers within the Royal Conservatory, a group thought to be myth, blamed for 3 historical disappearances and the mysterious fire that destroyed the archives in 1972. This was no simple resurrection of a lost melody, it was an act of vengeance veiled as music, and Lucien hadn't merely recognized the changes in the score, he had recognized himself. That final modulation, the jarring shift in key, wasn't his mother's hand nor his teacher's, it was his own, from a piece he had written in grief but never published. Someone had found it, altered it, buried it within this performance like a landmine, and detonated it in public, not for admiration but for punishment. Evelyn now understood, the grief wasn't just Cordelia's to carry. Lucien too had buried something long ago, something shameful, perhaps even unforgivable, and tonight it had clawed its way back through the piano. As Evelyn folded the pages with careful gloved hands, her face betrayed nothing, but her mind was racing. The music had been played, yes, but the final movement was still to come, and when it did, it wouldn't be performed under lamplight. It would echo in silence, unfold in confession, and end not with applause but with consequence. The summons arrived with no more fanfare than a dying breath. A pale ivory envelope slipped beneath each door of the 3 surviving figures tied by blood, memory and betrayal to Ravenshade Hall. No postmark, no return address, only a single sentence written in brittle, spidery ink that seemed to bleed into the page like something alive. Your presence is requested at Ravenshade Hall this Sunday before dusk for closure. No signature, yet every curve of the letters was unmistakable, echoing the same ink that once graced the final page of Ambrose Branford's will, the document that fractured the family and cast long shadows over the moor for 2 silent decades. Alara Branford, the widow who wore mourning like a second skin, accepted the invitation without question. Her grief had long since turned to stone. Gideon Vale, once the family's closest confidant and legal mind, hesitated as he traced the lines of the letter with his thumb, the way one might skim a scar, and Lydia Morven, the housekeeper who had served 3 generations and buried 2, read the message aloud in a whisper as if repeating a curse, and muttered, "It begins again." None of them dared speak of that night 20 years ago, when the great Ambrose Branford collapsed mid-recital at his own piano, a single trembling note trailing into silence like a severed breath. The cause was listed as heart failure, yet no physician could explain the brown stain on the keys, nor why the manuscript, his unfinished sonata, was discovered rewritten in places he had sworn never to alter. The study where it all happened had been locked ever since, untouched, unswept, unspoken of, but as Sunday bled into dusk and the moors howled like wolves denied a kill, each of them returned to Ravenshade, not out of loyalty but because the hall had summoned them. No staff greeted them, only the wind through the cracked shutters and the creak of floorboards that seemed to remember their footfalls. The drawing room was preserved like a shrine, still clothed in the shadows of the night Ambrose died, candles flickering though no one had lit them, and on the piano the same sheet of music he had played last, though now its edges curled as if scorched and a fresh brown stain, reddish rust-like, blotted its lower corner. Alara saw it first but said nothing, only gripped the back of a velvet chair until her knuckles paled. Lydia took her seat near the curtains, farthest from the hearth, eyes wide with memory. Gideon lingered near the mantel, fingers twitching toward a brandy decanter he did not lift. Then as the grandfather clock struck 5, the air shifted. A mechanical click echoed through the room, followed by a low hum. The gramophone, silent for decades, whirred to life with a hollow breath, its disc already spinning. No symphony played. Instead, a voice, dry as old parchment and trembling with age, filled the room. Ambrose. "If you are hearing this," the voice rasped, "then the silence has failed." Alara gasped. Gideon went pale, lips parted in disbelief. Lydia clutched her crucifix and began to murmur. "You must listen," the voice continued. The truth was never in my words but in the music. In the final sonata, hidden beneath false harmonies, I encoded what I had learned. Someone altered it, someone feared it, someone poisoned my ink, the one I touched each day, slow, cumulative, undetectable, until it stopped my heart. That night was no accident. I know now who it was, and so shall you. The recording ended in a burst of static that melted into silence so heavy it felt solid. On the sideboard now rested 3 cream envelopes, none there moments before, each addressed in the same unmistakable ink: Miss Alara, Mr. Vale, Miss Morven. Without speaking, Alara stepped forward, her hands trembling as she opened hers. Inside, not a letter but a single page of music, 1/3 of the unfinished sonata. Gideon's brows furrowed as he ripped his envelope open, and then suddenly tore the contents in half with a hissed curse, as if burning a bridge already reduced to ash. Lydia stared at her envelope as if it might bite her, then whispered, "I served this house too long to betray its ghost," and placed it back on the table unopened. But the house was already responding. With a groan like breath drawn deep into ancient lungs, the double doors of the study slammed shut behind them and locked with a metallic snap that sent a shiver across the floor. Ravenshade had waited. It would wait no longer. There would be no music tonight, not with hands that trembled with guilt and eyes that could not meet one another's. Instead, what would play out now was a different kind of sonata, one written in silence, shaped by fear, and conducted by a hand long thought dead. For beyond the locked doors, in the hidden passage carved behind the library wall, a woman in a black veil watched through the narrowest of cracks. Miss Marwood, Ambrose's sister, presumed drowned in the icy lake all those years ago, stood motionless, a faint smile creeping over her lips as her brother's voice echoed once more in her mind. The concert had begun. Not one of music but of reckoning, and the final movement would end not in applause, but in confession. In the decaying grandeur of Windmere House, where ivy clawed at stone walls and the air carried the hush of secrets too long buried, the guests arrived under leaden skies and heavier intentions. The invitation, unsigned, yellowed at the corners and sealed with crimson wax, had been delivered with unnerving precision, addressed only to those who had once played a part in the life and perhaps the death of Hector Vale, the prodigious cellist, whose final performance had ended not in applause, but in a silence so unnatural it felt rehearsed. Evangeline Cross came first, her once celebrated hands now gloved, her stare hollow from years spent hiding from music and mirrors alike. Reverend Ashcroft followed, clutching his collar as if it could shield him from whatever awaited his sermons once powerful, now haunted by the weight of things unsaid. Last came Julian Merrow, the composer whose genius had curdled into bitterness after a public scandal linked him to the lost compositions of Hector's sister, Miriam Vale, who had vanished 5 winters ago beneath the frozen lake behind Windmere, presumed dead, mourned in whispers and quickly forgotten. Yet as they stepped inside the drawing room, unchanged since the night of Hector's final recital, they saw the grand piano, polished to a funereal gleam, not holding keys but a reel-to-reel recorder already spinning, its tape clicking as if rewinding time itself. The moment it engaged, a voice emerged, not Hector's but Miriam's, soft yet ragged, like someone speaking from the far side of water. "If you're hearing this," she began, "then the lie has lasted long enough." Her voice, broken but fierce, told of a requiem she had written in secret, stolen before it could be performed, and reworked under Hector's name to cover truths too dangerous for daylight. "One of you rewrote my grief," she accused. "One of you turned my music into a tomb." She spoke of notations altered with malicious precision, ink that wasn't hers, and a ledger hidden behind the chapel wall, names, dates, payments, and guilt transcribed in ledger lines and blood. "Hector found it," she whispered, "and he played it. That's why he died." As the tape hissed and clicked, the fire flickered out with a gust of cold air from the walls, and on the mantelpiece appeared 3 sheets of music, untouched by dust, sealed with crimson glyphs, each addressed to them by title, not name. The betrayer, the witness, the forger. Evangeline reached for hers and gasped. The notes were familiar, but wrong, her own annotations woven into phrases she swore she never wrote. Ashcroft's hands shook as he opened his, revealing a hymn twisted into a dissonant prayer, its structure poisoned by doubt. Julian stared at his seal and refused to break it. "She was never supposed to come back," he muttered, eyes fixed on the recorder, which now crackled again, this time with Hector's gasping voice. She knew I played the original. It wasn't safe." The sound cut off with a snap like a bone breaking. A second later, the lights died, plunging the room into darkness. When emergency lamps flickered on, Evangeline's sheet had vanished, Ashcroft's was aflame on the floor, and Julian stood alone, his face pale, his seal still unbroken, until it cracked open on its own, spilling fresh ink across the piano lid in the shape of a single name, Miriam. Behind the hearth, a panel creaked open to reveal dozens of photographs, grainy, unnerving, each showing the three of them in moments they could not recall being watched, at a graveside, near the lake, beside Hector's unmarked manuscript. And always, in the background, stood Miriam, unmoving, unsmiling, her eyes the only thing in focus. Beneath each photograph was a phrase: "You played, you heard, you lied." Outside, a figure in a sodden dress stood among the skeletal trees, head tilted, watching Windermere's light dim and throb like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the doors locked with a sound like a cello string snapping. The music they thought they'd buried had returned, not to be played, but to be answered, and the requiem, at last, would be heard, not for the dead, but for those who had outlived their guilt. Beneath the brooding canopy of rain-soaked pines that loomed over the secluded village of Thistlebridge, a silence began to thicken, not a peaceful stillness, but a breathless, brittle hush, like the world waiting for something long suppressed to stir once more. The unexpected return of Alaric Draymore, the once celebrated violinist who had disappeared from public memory in a shroud of shame and whispered legends, sent an almost seismic tremor through the town's forgotten streets. No one had spoken his name in decades, not since the tragic blaze at Elmswick Conservatory, where a prodigious student named Lucian Caro vanished into flames alongside the only known draft of Nocturne for the Unforgiven, a composition so enigmatic it was said to be less a piece of music than a coded confession. In the years that followed, Alaric's name was erased from concert programs, his portraits removed from halls, his legacy rewritten with absence. Now, after over 20 years cloaked in obscurity, he had returned, not in glory, but like a revenant summoned by the unfinished chord of a haunted past. He took up residence in the long-abandoned Greymore estate, where ivy strangled the stone walls and the air inside tasted of old grief. The house bore its silence like a wound, its piano sitting untouched beneath a moth-eaten cloth, its strings rumoured to whisper at night. Days after his arrival, a letter arrived, not addressed to him, but to Alara Quinn, an unassuming music historian from Windermere, with no known ties to Thistlebridge except a strange pull she could neither name nor deny. The letter bore no return address, only a pressed violet and a cryptic line penned in faded ink. He never played the final movement. Compelled by a mixture of intuition and academic obsession, Alara made the journey to Thistlebridge, only to find the village steeped in melancholic secrecy. Everywhere she turned, fragments of a forgotten melody emerged like breadcrumbs, 4 haunting bars scrawled in the margins of antique hymnals, etched with a penknife into train station benches, burned faintly behind the wallpaper of the inn's oldest suite. As she delved deeper, uncovering letters written in invisible ink and journals encoded with musical notation, a shadowy picture began to form. Nocturne for the Unforgiven had never been a simple composition. It was a buried truth, composed in whispers between Lucian and Alaric in the last days before the fire. The final movement, she discovered, contained hidden signatures and embedded ciphers, dates, initials, veiled accusations. Lucian had not perished in the fire. He had been silenced, but not by Alaric. As Alara confronted Alaric with the incomplete bars, he trembled as though the ink itself had scorched his soul. That night, without warning, the piano in Greymore sang again, and the house, thought long dead, filled with a sound so anguished and beautiful it made the walls weep. Alaric played in a trance, as if possessed by the ghost of the boy he'd lost. With each bow stroke, buried memories resurfaced. Lucian trapped behind a door barred from the outside, the flicker of a third silhouette beyond the flames, and the face of the man they had both trusted more than any other, Maestro Calowin. The final note was not merely played, it was released. As it echoed, the manuscript in Alara's hand ignited on its own, curling into ash and revealing, hidden beneath its folds, a silver locket containing a photograph of Lucian, Alaric, and Calowin, their revered mentor. The truth slammed into Alara with the force of a falling cathedral. Calowin had orchestrated everything. Afraid the boys had uncovered the truth buried in his personal journals, records of wartime atrocities masked beneath the guise of musical annotations, he had arranged the fire, ensured Lucian's silence, and framed Alaric with absence and despair. In the years since, Calowin had built a luminous career atop the bones of stolen genius, his crimes hidden within the pauses of a forgotten melody. But music, like memory, refuses to die quietly. Alara gathered the recovered evidence, letters, photos, encoded annotations, and sent them to an anonymous archival circle dedicated to exposing revisionist history. Days later, Alaric, gaunt but resolved, walked alone to a ruined chapel on the cliff's edge and performed Nocturne for the Unforgiven in full. The performance was filmed by a traveling journalist who had stopped by mere chance, and that one video, raw and echoing with unbearable beauty, ignited the world. It went viral, not for its virtuosity, but for its unmistakable sorrow. Within days, Calowin vanished from public life. His accolades were rescinded, his works reclassified, and the elite musical circles that once sang his praise now buzzed with his disgrace. Greymore Estate, once a mausoleum of memory, was transformed into a sanctuary for young musicians silenced by politics, trauma, or simply lack of privilege. Where once silence reigned, laughter now danced across the halls. Music bloomed from its rooms like spring after endless winter. Alara, her part played, quietly departed Thistlebridge, though the village never quite left her. And though she never saw Alaric again, she would sometimes hum the final bars of the nocturne in her study, each time struck by how it no longer carried sorrow, but something gentler, release. Still, she kept the letter safe in her journal, its final words etched in her mind like an epitaph. He never played the final movement, because it was meant to be heard only when the truth was finally ready to be believed. Beneath the waning light of autumn's grip, in the forgotten borderlands of East Fenlo, stood the Brackenmore Requiem Hall, once a sanctuary of sound, now a silent relic shrouded in ivy and unanswered questions. It had been closed for over 30 years, ever since the night its renowned conductor Elias Thorne collapsed mid-performance, and the final movement of his magnum opus, Elegy for a Drowned Voice, was never played. The orchestra dissolved, the hall shuttered, and Elias's protégé, Adair Lennox, vanished into seclusion, his promising career cut short by whispers of betrayal and madness. No one knew what had truly transpired, only that the final sheet of the composition was never recovered, and rumors spread that Elias hadn't died of natural causes. Now, decades later, a cryptic invitation was sent to Celine Harrow, an archivist known for restoring lost musical manuscripts, summoning her to Brackenmore with no sender's name, only a black envelope, a faded conductor's baton, and a single phrase inked in blood-red script: "The drowned voice has begun to rise." Drawn by a strange pull she couldn't explain, Celine arrived to find the hall decayed but untouched, as though waiting. Inside, the walls echoed not with music, but with whispers in dead languages, and piano keys occasionally depressed themselves in the night. She discovered locked drawers of Elias's journal, pages written in ciphered notations that mirrored the crescendos of the elegy itself. Each bar, when played, unleashed memories, not hers but someone else's, visions of Elias arguing with Adair beneath the chandelier, a shadow slipping poison into a crystal glass, and a woman's voice crying out from somewhere beneath the stage. The elegy, it seemed, was not merely music, it was a confession encoded in harmony, a dirge laced with names and sins. As Celine reconstructed the score piece by piece, strange things began to happen. The instruments in the orchestra pit tuned themselves at midnight. Water leaked inexplicably through stone, and in the reflection of the cracked rehearsal mirror, she saw not her own face, but that of a woman long drowned in Fenlo Lake, whose disappearance had once scandalized the town. The townsfolk watched Celine warily, their silence sharper than accusation, for they remembered how Adair had been seen near the lake that night, and how he claimed to hear music where there was none. When Celine uncovered a hidden passage beneath the conductor's podium, she descended into a forgotten sublevel, an ossuary lined with sheet music and bones. There, she found Adair's final note, never delivered, a plea to Elias for forgiveness, and a warning that the elegy was cursed, that every person who had heard it in full had either gone mad or vanished. Yet Celine couldn't stop. She completed the final bars, and at the stroke of midnight, she conducted the piece with the help of ghostly musicians who emerged from dust and shadow. The music awakened the truth. The drowned voice was Verena Thorne, Elias's daughter, whose murder had been masked as an accident, silenced by those who feared her knowledge of the maestro's wartime crimes, transcribed into music to keep it hidden forever. As the final note rang out, the hall convulsed, the ghosts howled, and in a flash of blinding light, every secret buried beneath the Requiem Hall was unearthed. Celine emerged shaken, clutching the restored manuscript and Verena's locket, now humming with warmth. The next day, the hall stood collapsed, nothing left but rubble and the faint scent of lilac and ash. She published the truth anonymously, and the elegy, released to the world, brought not fame but reckoning, funding frozen, legacies revoked, and those complicit finally named. The world moved on, but Fenlo did not forget. In the ruins, wild violets bloomed in unnatural patterns, and those who dared pass by claimed to hear the faint trace of a woman singing beneath the earth. Celine never returned, but in quiet corners, she sometimes played the elegy's opening bars, listening, not for music, but for silence broken, and for a voice once drowned now rising again. And now, as the final echoes of this haunting tale fade into silence, the question remains: had you stood in Evelyn Calder's place, alone in that withering manor where the wind still whispered forgotten names through cracked window panes, with the final cursed composition trembling in your hands like a heart that had stopped and dared to beat again, what would you have done? Would you have risked the melody that once shattered a legacy, that drove her beloved into shadows too deep for rescue, a piece born not of genius but of grief, of guilt, of something far older and darker than mere music? Could you have summoned the courage to finish what fate itself had silenced, to give voice to notes soaked in sorrow and steeped in secrets too dangerous to name? Or would you, like many before, have folded the score away, sealing it behind oak and dust and fear, hoping that time would do what memory would not forget? Tell us, truly. Would you have reopened the door to the past, knowing full well that some doors never close again? Would you have lit the candle in that cold room, knowing what it might awaken? We are listening. Your reflections, your choices, your theories matter more than you know. Leave them in the comments below. We read every single one, not just for answers but for insight, for the beautiful way mystery connects us across distance and silence. Your voice helps keep these stories alive, and if this tale stirred something within you, an old fear rekindled, a question left to linger like mist on the moors, then we invite you to join us again. Subscribe to this channel for more mysteries that breathe, that ache, that think, that wrap themselves around your imagination and won't let go. From the sharp elegance of Poirot's deductions to the quiet force of Miss Marple's empathy, and beyond into wholly original stories still waiting to be unearthed, we're building a home here for those who cherish the intricate dance of suspense, character, and the slow poetic unraveling of truth. And if you know someone, perhaps a friend who believes every creaking floorboard carries a memory, or a parent who once whispered bedtime stories laced with unsolved riddles, or even that quiet soul you pass in the library aisle who lingers just a moment too long at the mystery shelf, share this with them. Because sometimes the right story finds you just when you need it most. Thank you for walking this path with us, for stepping into the shadows and staying long enough to find the light. Until we meet again, wherever the next mystery may call, remember there is always more to the story than what is seen. Stay curious, stay brave, and as always, stay warm.